Coming up, are we living in history's most peaceful era?
War is more and more removed from the set of live options, the kind of thing that you would even contemplate as a way of resolving disputes.
Atlantic correspondent Robert D. Kaplan and Harvard professor Steven Pinker offer differing views on the long peace and future conflicts. It's just ahead on Global Ethics Forum.
Steven Pinker's book, The Better Angels of Our Nature, Why Violence Has Declined, goes right to the heart of the Carnegie Council's mission. A scholar of brain and cognitive sciences, language and moral psychology, we're delighted that Steven has aimed his recent work toward our area of concern, that is conflict and cooperation, war and peace. Robert Kaplan is one of the most thoughtful and accomplished analysts of world politics today. His new book, The Revenge of Geography, What the Map Tells Us About Coming Conflicts and the Battle Against Fate, is characteristically philosophical and practical, and I recommend it to you. Our topic this evening is the world becoming more peaceful? And rather than a debate, point to counterpoint, we've decided to have a conversation. There are many ways to look at this issue, and there are many perspectives to be shared.
The Better Angels of Our Nature advances the hypothesis that most people find literally incredible, that violence has declined over the course of human history on a variety of scales of time and magnitude. A little known fact is that war appears to be in decline. It's hard to discern this fact if you get your information from the news, because you never see a reporter in some part of the world saying, well, here I am and there's no war here today. Wherever the war is, that's where the journalists fly to. The first graph comes from a political scientist named Jack Levy, and it pertains to the war between great powers. This graph spans half a millennium, 1500 to 2000, and it plots the percentage of years in every 25-year period at which the great powers were at war with each other. And what the graph shows is that a few hundred years ago, the great powers were pretty much always at war with each other. And that's what great powers did. They fought other great powers. More recently, they have almost never been at war with each other. The last great power war, that is a war with one great power on each side, was concluded almost 50 years ago, namely the Korean War. I'm going to now zoom in on the last 100 years. The 20th century has been called the most violent in history. For a number of reasons, I think this is quite dubious, but the next slide shows the rate of death from all wars in the 20th century, not just the great power wars. And what the graph shows is, it actually extends to from 1900 to 2010, there were two unmistakable spikes of horrific bloodletting in the 20th century, concentrated on the two world wars. But contrary to many predictions that this was just the beginning of an escalating sequence, if you look after the spike for World War II, you see that the graph kind of wiggles a lot, but pretty much hugs the floor, and that the two world wars were not a sign of worse things to come, but something closer to a last gasp. So what went right? I go through a number of hypotheses. Democratization had something to do with it. There's good evidence that pairs of democracies tend not to fight each other. Liberalization of economic policies and globalization, free trade. Countries that trade a lot are statistically less likely to fight a war. The rise of international institutions, countries that both belong to a intergovernmental organization are less likely to fight each other. The increased costs of war, the fact that World War II proved that wars do an awful lot of damage to both sides that nullify most anticipated gains. But I think there's another factor that combines with the world's experience as to how destructive a war could be. And I'm sitting next to this repeated slogan, ethics matter, ethics matter, ethics matter. And I think ethics matter, not in the sense of just that, obviously they do by definition, just in a normative sense. But I think humans are moralistic animals. That doesn't necessarily mean that our morals lead us to do the right thing. Quite the contrary. I think the worst atrocities in human history were inspired by moralistic causes. But just that the nature of human moralization has changed. Namely, there is a shift both within countries and in international relations between a morality based on national grandeur, the supremacy of a race, a nation, a religion, a class, toward a more humanistic ethics where the flourishing of individual men, women, and children are elevated as closer to a cardinal virtue. And the reason that I think the carnage of World War II led to a change in sensibilities, but contrary to the predictions from the early 20th century that say the invention of smokeless gunpowder or dynamite or chemical weapons would make war obsolete, that didn't happen because destructive technologies only give people second thoughts when they're combined with an ethic that says human life is precious. I think it's that combination rather than just the destructive technology by itself that's necessary to reorient nations away from war. And so the change in norms has resulted in the fact that at least certainly among rich, developed, and Western nations, and increasingly trickling down to other parts of the world, war is more and more removed from the set of live options, the kind of thing that you would even contemplate as a way of resolving disputes. And I think that has led to fewer wars being initiated and the wars being terminated more quickly.
The first thing I'd like to say is, what were the reasons for this long peace since 1946? Steve gives a lot of reasons. One reason Steve doesn't go into, I would argue, is foreign policy realism. If you were to ask me what was the most moral initiative taken in the last few decades in foreign policy, many of you would probably say Richard Holbrooke in Bosnia, and that would be a good answer. I'll give you a better answer, Richard Nixon in China. Now, Nixon's motives were very, very realpolitik, not particularly uplifting. But what Nixon did was he said to the Chinese, you don't have to worry about Taiwan. We don't believe in the fiction that Taiwan's independent. You don't have to worry about the Soviets because we're teamed up with you now against the Soviets. You don't have to worry about the Japanese, whose economy was just starting to boom then. We'll take care of the Japanese. That's our responsibility. And he gave them a whole bunch of other assurances. And what did that do? For the first time in decades, or since the Hai Qing dynasty at the turn of the 19th century, China felt secure on the outside and could devote itself to internal development. And that set the context for Deng Xiaoping's liberalization. Another reason, why was the peace so long? Because you had realists like Dwight Eisenhower and others. One thing about Eisenhower people forget, it was under him that all the hydrogen bombs were built. And why did he build it? Because he didn't want to fight a real war on land in Europe. He wanted something so terrible but also so cheap, because nuclear weapons were cheap compared to preparing for actual conventional warfare. The Cold Warriors, rather than be parodied in Dr. Strangelove, actually kept the peace in many ways. Let's bring this all down to earth and see what are the real prospects for peace, or for a more peaceful world, I should say. Let me bring this debate, this discussion down to one part of the world. I don't want to use the Middle East because, in a way, that's too easy. You know, we know the horrors of the Middle East. I want to use East Asia. And the reason is East Asia's gone under an economic boom for decades. It's had mass education, women's rights, the feminization of culture. Almost everything that Steve writes about, you can see in East Asia, from Japan to Australia. So what's the result? One of the greatest arms races in history now. Japan is coming out of its quasi-pacifistic shell to become a real military power. Nationalism is on the rise in Japan. The Japanese Navy is 4 times the size of the British Royal Navy and much more deployable with niche capabilities in submarines and special operations forces. China, since the mid-90s, has built a great Navy and Air Force. Everyone, the Vietnamese, the Chinese, the Malaysians, they all have a shop till you drop policy on the acquisition of submarines, both nuclear and the latest quiet diesel electric. The Australians, with a population about the size of Canada, are putting an extra $20 billion just into fourth and fifth generation fighter jets and new submarines. What is driving this? Well, several things, which are relevant to Steve's book, which is, one, if you were to ask me as a journalist on the ground, what's the biggest underrated force out there in the world today? I would say nationalism. It's really stark. You see it in public demonstrations. And when the Chinese tell me in Beijing they would love to compromise on the territorial claims they're making in the East Sea and the South China Sea, they tell me we can't because the nationalist genie is out of the bottle and the party is afraid. The party is afraid to compromise so that it can't. So nationalism is not dead. It may have passed its peak in the West, but it's rising at a great trajectory in a part of the world that's not minor, but in fact the geographical heart of the global economy and of global demography too. If you call Asia everything from India eastward up to Japan. And what are people fighting over? Not even islands, but rocks that are under the sea during high tide. And yes, these rocks may have oil and natural gas around them, but it's a contest for status, for king of the hill. That's what I see it as about when I talk to people there. And I'd like Steve to comment on that in a little while, because the contest for status is still very much alive in the human psyche. And remember, we're talking about East Asia. We're not talking about a poor part of the world where there are tribes fighting or this or that. We're talking about people who have bullet trains, who go to work in suits and ties, and who totally support bigger and bigger defense budgets.
It seems to me that there are a lot of developments surrounding the long peace and what I call the new peace, that is the spread of the long peace to the rest of the world since the fall of the Soviet Empire. They don't obviously fit any realist narrative, including the one that appeals to nuclear deterrence. The fact that you've had a lot of non-nuclear states defying nuclear ones, Argentina trying to take back the Falklands, defying Britain, a nuclear power, Saddam Hussein thumbing his nose at the United States repeatedly, Sadat invading Israel-held Sinai. There doesn't seem to be a whole lot of relationship between military expenditures and probability of actually getting into a war. And East Asia might be a perfect example where for the last 25 years, I don't think there have been any shooting wars. China, contrary to all predictions that rising great powers always pick on their neighbors, hasn't been in a shooting war since 1987, a better track record than some countries we happen to belong to, where the United States has been in a number of shooting wars. The political scientist James Paine wrote a fairly obscure but I think very insightful book called Why Nations Arm that tried to correlate different measures of being on a war footing with actual likelihood of getting involved in a war, and found that expenditures, military hardware, had a very loose relationship. What did have a stronger relationship was number of men in uniform, because the decision as to whether to close down a shipyard is driven almost entirely by politics. And because of the paradoxes of democracy, those with the strongest local interest push policy, those that pay the bill diffusely just don't notice. So you can have a ramping up of the defense budget because each military contractor, each state with a defense plant is in favor. Taxpayers in general, there isn't one constituency that opposes it. But if it's your son who's being drafted and sent in harm's way, then there's much more of a brake on nations' likelihood of picking fights and getting into trouble. And worldwide, even though military expenditures have not been going down, but percentage of the population in uniform has been going down. In terms of prognosis for the future, rather than just playing out scenarios in your imagination, which I think is a very fallible method of prognostication, and I have a whole list of predictions of wars deemed to be inevitable that never happened. Because, and here I'm going to speak as a psychologist, recalling anecdotes, visualizing scenarios is extraordinarily unreliable. It's a reflection of the imaginer's own psychology. It's a reflection of how vivid events are, how many inches of column space they get, how big a bang they make, but it doesn't take into account factors that really do predict war and peace.
One of the reasons why there are fewer and fewer people in uniform is because the nature of war is changing. The modernization of forces means you have smaller conscript militaries, but with higher quality, smaller militaries of volunteers that are much better trained. So that when the Warsaw Pact collapsed and NATO absorbed every country from Poland into Romania into NATO, the first thing NATO did is, we want you to fight better to be better killers. And in order to do that, we're going to make your military smaller. Because we don't want you to have 1,000 jets, old vintage jets. We'd rather you have 300 high-tech fourth-generation fighters. We don't want conscript armies that are good for just building roads and bringing in the crops. We want special operations forces. So that the nature of war itself is becoming more professionalized in a high-tech age. Where soldiers and Marines and sailors and airmen need to know so much more. They need to be better trained with different equipment, and therefore, because training is longer, the way to get a military that will actually fight and engage in a war is to make it smaller. The best example of that is the Chinese Air Force. The Chinese Air Force has come down from many thousands of planes to just about 2,000. But guess what? They're all fourth and fifth generation fighter jets. So you have fewer pilots, but the pilots that they are more lethal. So I would say just counting numbers doesn't show an understanding of how war itself is changing.
I agree that there has been obviously a very great shift in the composition of national forces and the mechanization, computerization of fighting, of the skill required of men and women in uniform. But part of that is itself a reflection of the fact that modern societies have much less tolerance for casualties than they used to, and for diversion of human capital into the military sector, which is partly why so much investment has been put into the robot warfare, drone warfare. You could imagine, even with a higher tech armed forces, that a country could still draft a lot of its college graduates and postgraduates and have them do all of that high tech work. The fact that armed forces have gotten more selective means there are fewer unskilled people, but it doesn't explain why nations don't just make up the difference by having more and more engineers, PhDs, increasing the ranks of the people who are designing and manning this equipment.
Thank you.
Mr. Pinker, at some point you mentioned that the nature of the human realization has changed. Yes. So could you please explain a little bit more about how that happened?
I think humans have always been moralistic animals. But that's a big problem. I think I write in the book that the world has far too much morality. That if you were to add up all of the individual homicides that the perpetrator believed at the time were morally justifiable, to exact revenge, to punish a transgressor, if you look at the casualty of religious wars, of utopian ideologies like communism and Nazism, they would vastly outnumber the deaths from just raw amoral predation. But I do think that the basis for our moralization has been changing, particularly since the Enlightenment. It's become more humanistic in the sense of valuing the life and flourishing of individuals as opposed to abstractions like religions, classes, nations, races, enforcing orthodoxies, enforcing deference to authority, enforcing moral purity, all of which go into the human moral sense. I take it that your question is, okay, but why did those happen? I suspect that the rise of literacy, education, mass communication, journalism, all played a role. The lives of other people became more immediate to us. By reading fiction, memoir, history, journalism, we enter the minds of other people, which makes it harder to demonize them and encourages a more universalism. We travel more, we're more cosmopolitanism, rub shoulders with people unlike ourselves. Because of the rise of mass media, war has become less romanticized. People have more of a sense that war is hell, and they have a more articulated moral philosophy.
The problem is a lot of people don't read serious fiction. They don't read serious nonfiction. Let me take Poland for an example. Poland is dramatically increasing its military budget because they don't trust the Russians. You talk about European defense budgets are going down. That's a generalization. It's not a real truth. The defense budgets in the countries closer to Russia are in fact increasing. So even in Europe, which we've reduced to being just a financial debt story, but where geopolitics are alive and well, because the Russians are flush with cash and are buying up all kinds of infrastructure now in Central and Eastern Europe. Nationalism is alive and well, and a lot of people just don't think this way.
And I don't think it has to be great literature. I mean, I think it can be soap operas and middlebrow literature. But just to be more concrete about what I had in mind, I mean, in this country, during the Second World War, the Japanese were considered subhuman. According to one opinion poll, 15% of the American population, when asked what should be done to Japan after an Allied victory, offered the solution of extermination. In our own country, we rounded up 100,000 Japanese American citizens. I think that's less likely now. The numbers certainly suggest that, and opinion polls, even in the more militant parts of at least the richer countries.
Stephen, when I was looking at your graph, I was thinking about 1945, 1948, the establishment of the United Nations, but also the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. I'd be curious from both of you, just in terms of the establishment of some sort of international moral norm or standard for political leaders and for military leaders. Does that play at all into your your story? And if so, if you could elaborate a little bit.
Yeah. Well, the United Nations has a mixed role. Obviously, the soapbox orations in front of the General Assembly are just kind of theater to comedy, so those are irrelevant. The peacekeeping forces, though there have been some conspicuous disasters, on average, they do much more good than harm. And a number of studies have measured that if you put United Nations or other peacekeeping forces between warring parties, the war is much more likely to stop, and it's much less likely to reignite. The third thing that also matters is a norm that basically member states of the United Nations are immortal. They don't go out of existence, unlike centuries of history in which states just gobbled each other up. Poland gets wiped up off the map repeatedly. No United Nations member state has been eliminated through conquest. In fact, it's almost extremely rare, even for any territory, to have changed hands by conquest since the establishment of the UN. And the exceptions almost prove the rule. Iraq invaded Kuwait. It took short work for an international coalition to push them back.
Let me just say that that's true, but what's also true is that states have collapsed internally. And that has led to significant degrees of violence. You've had Somalia collapsed, Haiti, the former Yugoslavia. The Soviet Union collapsed violently in Tajikistan and in Nagorno-Karabakh and other places in the Caucasus, but generally non-violently in the Baltic states. So you have this sort of inverse problem here. A state is inviolable, but the UN can't keep it from collapsing internally. But to answer your question, is there a moral ethic? And I would say just because you're a democracy and you hold elections, and you believe in the global good and advancing global civil society, does not mean that your use of military force will necessarily have a moral result. It could have a negligible result, it could have an immoral result, it could have a lot of results, and therefore, even democracies, especially democracies, have to be especially wary of getting involved militarily around the world.
Iraq and Vietnam are two good examples.
Yeah.
And I think it's certainly true that the Iraq War would not have happened had it not been for 9/11. Even though there was no causal connection, there was enough spillover emotion that more of the population mobilized behind it than would have otherwise.
Yes, and Vietnam, remember, people forget the history. When we entered into Vietnam, it was for moral reasons,
Yeah.
we told ourselves. Because the North Vietnamese communists, as ruthless as a bunch of people as anyone can imagine, had killed tens of thousands of their own people before the first U.S. regular ground troops arrived. So there was a moral reason to do this, so we told ourselves.
I think with that, I'm going to adjourn the session with a mixture of moralism and realism. I want to thank Stephen and Robert and all of you for participating.
Thank you. Thank you. That was great.
For more on this program and other Carnegie Ethics Studio productions, visit carnegiecouncil.org. There you can find video highlights, transcripts, audio recordings, and other multimedia resources on global ethics. This program is made possible by the Carnegie Ethics Studio and viewers like you.